because I know when you are limited equipment, it's really bloody hard to think about variety and things you can do differently, because quite frankly, the basics work. Simple is usually very effective, but you also don't have a lot of choice. So she's really thinking outside the box here and actually putting time into the creation of this workout, which I really respect. Cracking straight on with it. Fitness KayKay, 20-minute intense legs workout, lower body, quads, hamstrings, glutes, no equipment, no repeat. The reason why I chose this workout is not only is it because it's actually her most recent workout at this time, or at least one of them, she's also somebody who's been recommended for a very long time. Somebody I haven't actually got around to covering until today, told you I would. And also hamstrings. I've mentioned this before, but hamstrings are notoriously very difficult to work out at home, especially if you don't have equipment. I'm actually curious to see how it's done. So I'm gonna crack on with it. And the deal is, if throughout this entire video you actually learn something from this video, then I'd really appreciate it if you did subscribe to the channel, but again, only if you learn something. If you don't learn anything from this video, dislike it, block me, and never see my oversized forehead again. This is an interesting one because it's how do you differentiate between a split squat and a static lunge? They kind of do the same thing. As far as like home workout movements go, especially ones without equipment, probably one of the better ones I'd say for your quads and your glutes, because not only are you working the quads in their like mid position, which is probably irrelevant for a lot of people, you're also working the glutes in their lengthened position, and that's a pretty good time. So immediately straight off the bat, you've got a solid movement. The big thing here, if you want to work the quads more, bring your front foot closer and elevate that heel, which means you'll get more knee travel, thus more quad lengthening, thus more quad utilization. If you want to work the glutes more, as she's doing here, keeping that shin a bit more vertical, that's going to again limit knee travel and maximize how much the glutes are having to work. Therefore, this would actually be arguably slightly more glutes dominant, which is cool. Most people probably actually want that. Then we're going to do a sprinted jump, same leg. Okay, so it's a nice little combination between not only these kind of typically deemed to be resistance-based movements or movements that are primarily focused on like hypertrophy, let's say, because obviously resistance, there is no additional resistance here beyond just the body weight, with some more like plyometric explosive stuff. I like that, and it's also quite a nice intensifier as well, because you're going from same side split squats into an explosive based movement, which then in turn is going to allow you to kind of push that working side a bit more, because obviously I know that not everybody watching this purely wants to focus on hypertrophy, so I'm trying to consider the fact that other people are actually looking at caloric expenditure as well, and doing these more exaggerated movements like these jump motions are going to again obviously increase caloric expenditure. All I say is this, is when you are doing these unilateral movements, so one side at a time, weakest side first. Always start with your weakest side. It makes no sense to start with your stronger side, because then again you're potentially only just maybe increasing the gap between the sides. So if one's already overdeveloped or stronger than the other side, you start when you're first, when you're fresh, low fatigue, you're probably just going to make that gap bigger. You don't want that. Weakest side first and then go into the stronger side afterwards, because again you actually want to close that gap. Tempo squat essentially refers to adjusting the tempo, so that slower eccentric, so way down, a pause, slower concentric, so way up, whatever you want to do. Tempo squat's actually really good to implement when you're looking at fixing technical cues, because again it gives you a little bit more time in the movement, which then in turn allows you to think a bit more about what you're doing and drill the necessary cues needed to make sure your squat is good. Her squat here, pretty bloody fantastic. Good depth, good distribution of weight across the foot, there's no caving. Ideally when you are squatting, you want to think about driving your big toe, little toe and heel into the floor, a triangle of pressure, thus distributing weight across your midfoot. She seems to be doing this really well. I respect it. And again, when you are at home and you are limited to lack of equipment, let's say, although tempo isn't really going to be a big thing for like building muscle, it can make the movement a little bit harder, which could then potentially compensate for the lack of equipment, or at least maybe close the gap a bit. Similar to what I said before, you kind of gain a mix between what would typically normally, if weight were included, deemed to be more of a resistance movement, and also something that would typically deem to be more of like a caloric expenditure based movement, where there is a lot more explosive movement happening, as we're seeing here. Linky movements with a pretty relevant, pretty similar pairing, which I like. I respect that. Again, like the other movements we've seen, very much quad and glute focus here, where you're spending a bit more time in this bottom position and kind of getting yourself off the floor and back up again. This is going to put a bit more tension on the quads, because you're essentially holding a pause here at the bottom between reps. Again, is this going to be like amazing for building muscle? I mean, working out at home, you are going to be limited, but the one thing I appreciate about this is that of all the home workouts I've seen, and I have seen many, I haven't seen anybody do something like this. So the fact she's including good exercise variety, I really appreciate and I really respect. Things like this are hard because they're again very much what I would call like a burn-based movement. So movements that really encourage a lot of hurting, which then in turn makes people think it's really worky or is really worky effectively. I've said this before, just because you're hurting it doesn't mean you're necessarily working it effectively. And that essentially comes from the fact you're just maintaining a pretty constant state of tension for the quads, especially here, and arguably the glutes, which then in turn is going to lead to a lot of that burning sensation. Doesn't mean it's going to be necessarily amazing for developing that area, but it is going to hurt a lot. And if that's what you're trying to achieve, you want movements that actually hurt you, despite maybe not being the most effective movements, then sure, that's reason enough to do it. Just be wary of your back position. When people do movements like this, it's very common for people to start really hunching over and really letting their back go because you get fatigued. So just keep that in mind. Just keep your back in a relatively neutral position, a tempo here, and maybe arguably adjusting the back foot position so it's slightly more stacked behind. Again, very much working similar muscles, so there's not really much to say about this. The same things apply regarding shin positioning, how that's going to potentially impact which muscles are maybe taking a bit more of the load. So when you're adopting more of like a sumo stance, so this really wide stance, there is a potential argument that you can actually bring in slightly more of the adductors. So the adductors are the inner thigh muscles here. When you are in this wider stance, it does put them in a position where they might be more utilized, which for lots of people might be quite nice, but they're also heavily utilized when you squat really low. So when you go into like the bottom of a squat, do a really deep squat, and you drive out the hole, so out the bottom, and you notice your knees twitching in slightly, everyone always associates that with a bad thing. It's not. Realistically, your adductors are quite a driving force out the hole, and when your knees are twitching, that's just your adductors contracting and doing their job, hence the knee twitch to help get you out the bottom of a squat. Another lunge-based variation, the thing I'm kind of noticing here is through none of the movements we've seen thus far, the hamstrings aren't actually getting utilized to a point where I deem their involvement in a movement to be adequate for stimulus. And what I mean by that is they're not being utilized in what I would deem to be an effective manner. And this is kind of why I theorized at the start, is that it's really hard to work your hamstrings at home without any equipment, because realistically the two primary things you've got to think about is a knee flexion based movement, so a movement where you're just bending the knee against resistance, so like a leg curl, and also like a hip hinge movement where you're essentially kicking the hips back and lengthening the hamstrings, so like an RDL, a good morning, or a stiff leg deadlift. Things you can't really do without any resistance here. So you could do a towel slide or something similar where you put a towel on the floor, lift your bum up and essentially perform a leg curl using the towel to then slide your feet in, because again, if you do it on the floor, your feet aren't going to move. Put the towel there, reduces friction and allows you to slide the feet in, which again could act as a fair, no equipment based hamstring movement. But so far we haven't seen any of that, and I did expect it. A donkey kick is going to be interesting because this is going to bring the glutes in a little bit more of an isolated fashion, meaning that the quads are going to be very limited regarding their involvement. Movements we've seen before, like the lunges and the split squats and things like that, the quads have been heavily utilized. Now the quads are kind of getting removed from that, and the glutes are going to be the prime movers here, which is fantastic. Again, the issue is with all these movements is when you are doing them against time, as she is here, it's key to remember how many reps you're doing per side. So if you do like your weaker side first and then go into the stronger side, if you solely rely on time, there's a chance you could do more reps or less reps. So what I would say is if you do like a weaker side first, try and match the number of reps in the following side, because your tempo might be different. And again, especially if you're using resistance, you wouldn't want to end up doing more on the stronger side, further enhancing like the strength gap between sides. Very quickly, I've got to say, have a look down below in the description of this video. You'll find the link to apply for TFNL online coaching. You'll find the link to apply for the TFNL group coaching, which is both at home and at the gym. And you'll also find the link to the TFNL workout guide, with a new one coming being a nutrition guide in the coming weeks. So if any of those tickle your pickle, have a look at the description down below and let me know what's tickling the pickle. This is actually a really fair movement, and one that I actually fully back. I think this is actually quite good. It's a very different variety of squat. This allows you to kind of train in a slightly different fashion, where rather than going forward and back as most of our movements typically do, you are able to get that side to side motion, which from like a hypertrophy perspective, so building muscle, is kind of irrelevant, doesn't really matter. But from an enjoyment perspective, it might be a bit nice and a bit different. We're supersetting that with a lateral lunge with knee drive. Again, you see supersetting two similar movements to potentially enhance or increase the difficulty of those movements, because again, you're doing two similar variations back to back, meaning that the muscles you're working throughout these variations aren't really allowed much time to breathe, recover, and replenish, which then in turn could increase the difficulty of the workout that might potentially for some people not be difficult enough due to the lack of equipment. So I like that. I think it's quite a smart pairing and I respect that. Bit different, a bit of variety, and it's also nice that she's including movements I don't commonly see in home workouts. I think from that perspective, I'm quite impressed, and I quite appreciate the fact that we are having so much variety, because I know when you are limited to equipment, it's really bloody hard to think about variety and things you can do differently, because quite frankly, the basics work. Simple is usually very effective. Quite frankly, you also don't have a lot of choice. So she's really thinking outside the box here and actually putting time into the creation of this workout, which I really respect. So from this, we're going to like a squat tiptoe roll thing. Again, it brings a lot more of the calves involved, because you are getting that tiptoe where you're lifting your heels off the floor. What I would say though is actually quite important for calf training, if anyone actually cares, is the stretch position seems to be a really important position for calf training. So if you can, I would definitely try and stand on something, like if you had like a step up or like stairs at home maybe, stand on them, use that additional range of motion to really stretch to the bottom for like a calf raise or similar, and hold that stretch for a few seconds. Trust me, it's nasty, it feels like crap, but provided you push that hard enough, it's probably actually be pretty good for calf development if that's something you care about. But as a whole, actually, like, I've already given the conclusion here, is that I'm actually impressed. Again, it's not my kind of workout because it's not the stuff I like to do, but I understand a lot of you like home workouts and like to venture beyond the realm of just hypertrophy. So I think if you are looking at just essentially what this is, a no equipment home workout, it's key to understand that results regarding muscle growth will be limited due to lack of progressive overload and lack of resistance, but results regarding caloric expenditure could be great, and sure, you are going to get some growth from this because there is a resistance of your body weight, and also it might actually be quite enjoyable. And one thing that people commonly forget is that to do something well and to stick with something, you probably need to enjoy it. And if you can turn around and say you enjoy doing this workout, which provides a lot of variety compared to a lot of other home workouts I've seen, then I think that's very fair reason to do it. And if it helps you achieve your goals, who am I to tell you otherwise? As a whole, it's good stuff. Obviously, I mentioned the whole lack of hamstring involvement here, which quite frankly, I kind of expected it, and this is not her fault by any means. You're quite limited. But like I said, you can always add in like a towel slide variation at the end if you want to get some hamstring involvement, which I would encourage, because if you neglect the hamstrings, neglecting any muscle group is probably going to bite you in the future regarding developmental issues and maybe even potentially injury risk as well. Like with all my videos, this is just my opinion, and I'd love to hear yours in the comment section below. But until the next one, thank you for tolerating me, thank you for tolerating another home workout waffle, and thank you for tolerating the video.